I was. Hi, everybody. Happy Monday. Good to have you all here. Really appreciative that you all joined today. Excited to talk to you about who we are and then share a little bit of wisdom and then also some tools that hopefully can resource you and others in your circles. For today and for weeks to come, months to come, and then as we all kind of navigate the work that we're doing that's really valuable in the world. So with that being said, my name is Francisca Porchas Coronado, and I am the founder, national coordinator of a network that's called the Latinx Therapist Action Network. I want to say thank you so much to the Detention Watch Network for this space, for doing the tech work today, for this webinar, and also some of the organizing, and just appreciative of Detention Watch Network in general for the beautiful work that they and that we, because we're part of it, do in the world. So with that being said, we're gonna start, and we're not going to be opening up this space for questions necessarily, because it might get a bit overwhelming, but we do want to invite people to use the question and answer feature on this webinar, which you'll see at the very bottom. It says Q&A, and it looks like a little filing cabinet to me. I don't know what it might look like to other people in a queue. You just click on that and then you can write your questions. And then also you can use the chat and just let us know what you're thinking as you're hearing what we're putting out, because we want to hear from you. So with that being said, I am going to share my screen, just bear with me. Hopefully it shows up perfectly. Yes, so I want to, so today's webinar has had many titles over the last couple of weeks. Trauma, Our Bodies, and Our Healing. We want to make sure that we're able to not only tell you a little bit about how we define trauma and how it shows up on our bodies, but also about the ways in which you can begin to tend to it in a mindful, aware way, and then begin to kind of shift some of what shows up. So with that being said, let me tell you a little bit about us. It'll be brief. Again, we're the Latinx Therapist Action Network, and we have been around for about a couple years, and we are a network of mental health practitioners that are dedicated to tending to the emotional and mental spiritual needs of people in the migrant rights movement, people in the front lines, leaders, and then also all kinds of folks that do support migrant people, from attorneys to educators to mental health practitioners themselves. It is a Latinx therapist network, meaning there are therapists from across the country that are part of it. We are in about 30 states right now. One of them, Lu Rocha, who you're gonna meet, is a therapist in Chicago. And that's one of our focus. The other is to have a directory, which is a resource for you all, of culturally grounded, radical thinking therapists who are down to do the work with you all, who believe in healing justice and also believe in abolishing ICE, and who want to tend to the needs of our folks in a way that is respectful of their self-determination, their agency, and their whole selves, right? And we're also here, like, check our website out, and also know that we are a resource that can support in not only the emotional ways, but also politically, and that we are in solidarity and can be called upon to be activated politically as well, not just to be in therapy with or in healing circle with. So I just wanted to name that, and I wanted to give an opportunity for Gabby or Andrea to tell you a little bit about what Detention Watch Network is, for many of you who might not know, who are on this webinar.
Hello everyone, my name is Gabriela Marquez Benitez. I am part of the membership team within Detention Watch Network, and I'm based out of Chicago as well. I'm really excited to be here with you all, and I just wanted to share that at Detention Watch Network, we're really grateful and humbled to have the Latinx Therapist Action Network to be a member and to be able to provide this opportunity and this space, both for our membership and beyond, specifically in this time where we believe that trauma is hitting in so many in so many different ways, especially within our network, which is a coalition of organizations and individuals that are fighting to end immigrant detention. And as the call to free them all continues to grow, so does that ache and that very hard process for families in our communities also continues. So we hope that this is a helpful resource and that folks are also continuing to plug in to the Latinx Therapist Action Network. I also want to name that I will be interpreting for this webinar. We do have simultaneous interpretation in Spanish. So also a friendly reminder to our panelists, Francisca and Tulu, of interpretation and to be mindful of pace, right? We will also be entering in the line information for folks to be able to join us in the simultaneous Spanish line on the chat box. So we invite folks to be active on the chat box, and we invite folks to enter questions on the Q&A chat. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Gabby. So we're gonna start, and I'm gonna hand it off to Lu Rocha to begin the presentation.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Lu Rocha, and before I speak, anytime that I speak from home, which is Chicago, Illinois, I always want to acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, and being in Illinois, that would be in the Great Lakes, so the nations and the caregivers that were here before I arrived, and I'm humbled to be a guest on this land. I'm also humbled to have been asked to come and talk to you all about trauma. Just a little bit about myself, who I am and why I'm here. I am the founder of two businesses. One is a multicultural consulting services where my colleagues and I try to train service providers on how to best provide service to their community members or constituents from a cultural, accessible manner. I have been doing domestic violence and sexual violence for over 25 years. And I've worked with trauma survivors for that same amount of time. My approach to my therapy, I have a private practice where the majority, I would say just about every client that I have, except for a few, are people identify as people of color. And the way that I approach my therapy is pretty much how I approach life, which is I understand the theory, but I also put into practice talking about policies and how that affects the individual's mental health. I talk about generational trauma. I also talk about historical trauma because the people that I work with are people of color. We talk about colonization. So if you were to be in the room with me and one of my clients, we would be talking about these issues and when it's applicable and how that affects the individual, their mental health, their physical health, and their spiritual health as well. So a lot of what I incorporate in my private practice is talk therapy is wonderful. That's what pays my bills. But I also think that people need to have additional tools. So I do yoga with my clients. I do meditation, chanting, when it's applicable with my clients. If their spirituality is important for them and they're healing, then sometimes you do small little ceremonies during therapy. So I'm kind of like what I would say, un caldo de res, that I put everything that we have into the pot so that people can heal. So when I talk about trauma and trauma in the body, I like to give information that I want to give you all about trauma and the effects of trauma on the body, but then I like to give people tools, and I'm hoping to provide you all some tools, some very practical, accessible tools to you on how to deal with the effects of trauma in your body to help you continue on this journey. Before we talk about trauma, I think it's important that we all have the same definition of trauma. And the definition that I use when I talk to individuals about trauma, it's that it's an event that is actual or is perceived, a threat of death. It can be a serious injury, a threat for physical injury, or the health and well-being of an individual. And it's experienced, when it's experienced, it's overwhelming. It's the sense of powerlessness or horror. It's this sense of safety. Person can feel their emotional or physical survival is at stake. And so this can happen to you, or it can happen to someone else. And because we're talking to individuals who are actually doing work with the community, and they're experiencing trauma, or they have experienced trauma, and I know that the network is going to have something on vicarious trauma, but you can also be affected by witnessing, or and witnessing can be hearing about it or seeing it. So I'm grateful that they're going to have something about vicarious trauma, because I think we underestimate how much vicarious trauma can affect an individual. And so with that, if you can go to the next slide, Francisca. So when I work with clients, I like to give them as much information about what's happening in their bodies when they have experienced trauma. And I would say about 95% of my clients have all experienced some form of trauma. And we'll talk a little bit about the types of trauma, because I think it's important that we understand there are different types of categories of trauma. Because trauma is, people always use the word trauma so loosely. And I think we have to be very careful that we just don't call, like, I got a ticket on my car and I was just so traumatized by it. That's a lot different from the trauma that I see in my office. And that's the type of trauma that I'm talking about today. And so when we talk about trauma, there is something that actually happens in the body that affects the individual and the individual's ability to deal with life stressors. And so in this slide, if you were to look at the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is, it's not on this slide, but if it's at the front part of the brain, it's called the newer part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that helps you make decisions, focus. It affects your personality. It helps you process things. But what happens in a traumatic event, that prefrontal cortex is not involved. What's involved is the amygdala that reacts to a stress or a threat. And so the important thing to think about and to know about the amygdala is that it's the very primitive part of the human brain. This is the part of the brain that we share with other animals. And it's the part of the brain that is the fight, flight, and I don't have it on the slide, but it's the freeze response as well. And so if you ever saw that, if you ever heard of the remark, a deer caught in deer and headlights, it's, you know, this sudden stop. If we're crossing the street, all of a sudden a car comes, we stop. And that's not because we use our prefrontal cortex. It's because the amygdala kicks in, and that's the freeze mode sometimes. And so what happens is the amygdala is kicked in when there is a threat. That activates the nervous system, which releases adrenaline. And then it then kicks in these glands that we have that releases the cortisol, which is the continued alertness, right? And so, and also because this is an instinctual response of the body, there are other things that happen to the body. So the pupils dilate. And so let's just say we are a deer and there's a lion, and the lion is after us. Our pupils need to dilate to see where is the threat, and then how do I get away. And so this is happening to the body with us not even knowing when we go through some type of threat. Our mouths start to dry, and our hearts start to beat faster. Our muscles tense, and then our digestion starts to slow down. And the reason that our digestion starts to slow down is that the circulation of blood that goes throughout our whole body and the nutrients that go through our whole body are focused to the four limbs when there is a threat. So when the amygdala kicks in, nervous system is activating, there's this consistent alertness in our body. Our muscles tend to tighten up. And the reason that it does is because it needs the strength to fight against something, or the speed to flee. And so the muscles tend to tighten up. The digestion then slows down because the nutrients is now going to the stomach, because the body is not thinking about eating. The body is thinking that it's under threat, and it has to use its energy for the four limbs. And so the digestion is slow. My experience in working with women is that they report that they have trouble with their period. And it makes total sense. Either they have a heavy flow or they don't have a flow. And the reason being is because the nutrients that's supposed to go to the reproductive systems is being depleted of the nutrients, just like the stomach. And so what I see a lot in my practice is people with, and I'll talk a little bit about the physical effects of trauma, but it's the effects of, stomach problems, having ulcers, very sensitive stomach, women having heavy periods. And so when I talk to them and I hear that they've been going through trauma, then I understand that, oh, okay, it makes sense, because you are experiencing the body, the physiological effects of trauma. Now, let's say, when I said I would tell you about the different types of trauma. So there's an acute trauma. So that's a trauma that happens just once, a car accident, a house fire. That's an acute traumatic event. So if you were to come to my office and you said you had a car accident, and you can't get into your car, you're afraid of cars, that's the only trauma that you've experienced or that you remember, then I would say that you are going through an acute traumatic event. There's chronic trauma. Chronic trauma can be anything like domestic violence, being bullied, something that continues to happen repetitively, right? And that's the type of trauma that I see. And then the other type of trauma that I see is complex trauma. We're talking about if there was a traumatic event, so community violence, maybe childhood abuse, genocide. So something that has happened, and especially if it happened to you at a very young age, then that would be categorized as complex trauma. So those are the type of traumas that I would say that you would see this type of effect. And this slide I really like a lot, because I have a few clients that when we're doing breathing exercises and I'm having them scan their bodies, one of the things that, I ask them, like, what do you feel? Where do you feel it? And a few of my clients say, well, it feels like electricity. It feels like electricity is going through my body. And again, looking at the physiological effects of what's happening in their body, it makes total sense, right? We're talking about the tightness of the muscles. Well, if your muscles are tightening, your muscles are going to apply pressure on your nerves, the circulation of blood. So if you were to hold your wrist like this for a long time, you're applying pressure on the nerves, then your fingers start to tingle. It's the exact same thing with the rest of the body. Then you get that electricity feeling. So if you're constantly feeling stressed, then you feel like you are constantly in like electricity going through your limbs. And what I tell my clients is what I really want them to do is to have these endorphins moments and the muscles relaxing. And that's our goal, is for them to feel better in their bodies, so that they're not feeling all the time like electricity going through the bodies, but more like a feeling of energy, of feeling this bliss, this love hormone, right? The endorphins making them feel this natural high. And go on to the next slide. And so one of the things that we're going to try to cover today is to talk a little bit about what are tools that you can do to help you with the effects of trauma on your body. And actually we can, we'll go over this a little bit later, but I want to talk a little bit about what are the initial reactions of trauma. And so if we're talking about the physiological effects, I think it's also important that we talk about the emotional effects. And so we have individuals that when they go through trauma, they feel confused. Again, you're not using your prefrontal cortex, so you couldn't process the traumatic event. It went to the amygdala, so you feel confused, and then that confusion lingers on. Anxiety, we see people who have anxiety after they experience trauma. They have dissociation, so they don't feel like they're in their bodies. A lot of people say that they feel kind of numb. And then we have people who have the low energy, headaches. We know more now about trauma than we did before, and studies have shown us that because of that physiological, what's happening physiologically in your body, that happening once is okay. It's wonderful. Like if we're, the example I give is that if we're in our homes and we're sitting all of us in our living rooms, and all of a sudden a bear comes in, what I just told you about the amygdala, that's all going to kick in, and that's going to keep us alive, right? If we're going to either fight the bear and lift something and hit the bear over the head, or we're going to escape the bear and run out of the room to get away from the bear, that's perfect. That's how the body is supposed to react. That's what's kept the human race alive until present day. But then what happens if you're constantly traumatized? What happens if you never learn how to deal with the trauma? If you're constantly anxious, if you're constantly stressed out, then what happens is that your immune system is actually being affected, and your immune system then decreases, and then that's when you would get illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, ulcers, rheumatoid arthritis. And so the trauma, the effects of trauma, and never processing it and getting some healthy skills to deal with the effects can actually cause physical harm on your body. And so, because again, if the bear comes in your room one time, that's good. But what if the bear is always coming in your room? Or what if you're afraid that the bear is in the hallway? Then you're constantly your amygdala is constantly kicking in the nervous system, and the adrenaline is constantly circulating in your body, and the nutrients are being depleted from your core body, part of your body. So that's just something to keep in mind for those who feel that they might be experiencing a traumatic event or never were able to process the trauma. And then we have people, again, with chest pains and chest. It's in the chest because that's part of the muscles, right? And so you're constantly having chest pains, and you feel like you're having a heart attack. And so then we get into panic attacks, insomnia, not being able to sleep. We have people who have skin problems, loss of hair. And then we have cognitive effects, right? Then we have constant worrying. Then we have racing thoughts, inability to focus. Again, part of what's happening to the brain. Then we have behavior effects, change of appetite, maybe nervous behavior, not trusting in people, or self-harm behaviors. And so trauma can affect people in many ways, but I want to go to knowing all of this now about people who are working either in the work that you all do with individuals who are going through trauma, because I think that we need to understand that, first of all, many of us are in doing this kind of work because we are affected by it personally in some personal way. And what's important to understand is that if you are a person of color, in this case, if you are a Latinx individual, a lot of their stories may sound like your stories. A lot of their experiences may sound like your experience or a family member's experience. And so that can cause some emotions for you that perhaps can be stirring up the pot for you. I always tell my clients that when we start talking about traumatic events, or we start to remember these traumatic events, it's like stirring up that pot of frijoles, right? When you are cooking frijoles de olla, which I've been doing a lot these days because I've been cooking my own food because I've been in home. You know, the ones that are not cooked come up on top, and then those are the emotions that come up related to trauma. And so if you're doing work with individuals who are experiencing trauma, then you are going to stir up that pot for yourself. And so it's important to understand that there's a physiological effect of trauma, and then there's that physical effect, and there's emotional and cognitive effects of trauma. And so we need to be aware of these effects if we continue doing this work. Now, I know that was a lot of information, and I'm trying to get through it because we have limited time. So if you have questions, please post those questions. If you want me to explain something again, if you didn't understand it, there's a question box there, Q&A box. Please use that, and I'll be happy to review any of your questions. So when we talk about trauma and doing trauma in working with individuals who are in fear of being deported, of being detained by ICE, I think it's important that we understand that it might cause us to again to feel anxious, to feel stressed out, and without us even knowing, we might be feeling our chest is tightening, we might be feeling our hands are going numb. And so one of the things that I do with my clients is I teach them how to breathe. I think 50%, well, maybe about 40-50% of my work is teaching people how to breathe and how to center and how to feel their emotions, so that the effects of the trauma is, they have a little bit more of a handle with the effects of trauma. So if you can go to the slide before that, I think it was the slide before that about the three-part, yeah. So one of the things that I do, I'm a registered yoga instructor, and one of the things that I do with my clients is I do different types of breathing practices that I learn in yoga. And the one that's very simple is the three-part breath. Now, having said everything about what's happening in the body, what happens when you breathe and why it's so important is, one, we don't know how to breathe. If you've ever seen a newborn baby, you'll see the stomach rises really high and then it just collapses. That's because the newborn baby still knows how to breathe, taking all the air in and then let it all out. We adults, because we're living in this society, we breathe from our chest, very, very shallow. We look at our phones, we breathe, our shoulders are front, we are on the computer, we drive, so our posture is like this. If we are feeling some kind of fear, our posture is like that too, because we go into the fetal position, right? And so what I teach my clients is we need to breathe, we need to open up the chest. We need to get oxygen into our lungs. That oxygen is going to go from our lungs into the bloodstream. The bloodstream then is going to carry it into our brain, and then our brain is going to carry it to the rest of our body. So what's happening? The oxygen is coming in. It's sending signals to our brain. There is no bear in the room. You're okay. That then sends signals to the rest of the body, and the four limbs and the rest of the body is relaxed a little bit more. Body then feels relaxed, sending signals to the brain saying everything's okay. So it's a cyclical reaction, right? So everything is connected. Your fears, your emotions is connected to the body. What the body feels is connected to the brain and your emotions and thoughts. So we cannot separate ourselves from our mental health, to our physical health, to our spiritual. We can't. We're too complicated. It's all meshed into one. So the breathing is part of one of those tools that I hope that my clients leave with when they see me, is that they can do this for themselves. They can inhale deep. And maybe you want to practice with me. And so we inhale deep through our nostrils. And then we're going to exhale through our mouth as if we're blowing through a flute. So the first step is to sit up straight in your chair. If you're on the floor, sit up straight. The reason being is that we have a diaphragm muscle underneath our lungs that automatically goes down when the lungs expand, right? So if we're sitting like this, like the first image, that's not going to allow the lungs to expand, right? Because we want to get as much oxygen into the body, right? So we sit up straight, roll the shoulders back, and that opens up the chest because, like I said, the muscles are going to go like this, right? Because we're afraid and we're tense. So we want to open up those muscles. And then also, if we're sitting up straight, the ribs, the way our body is made, it has cartilage. And so when the lungs are expanding, the rib cage is expanding too. So that's the reason why your mother always told you to sit up straight. There was a good reason behind that. And for me, for the breathing, is for you to be able to get as much breath as possible. Placing one hand on your chest, one hand on your stomach, without doing anything different. And if you like, you can close your eyes or a soft gaze in front of you. Just feel anything. Just feel what you feel without doing anything different. Just breathe your normal way. And then what I want you to do is to inhale deep through your nose. Exhale through your mouth, as if you're blowing through a flute. A couple more times. Hopefully, what you found is that your hand on your chest and on your stomach are moving. That's how we're supposed to breathe. The next slide is just going back to your natural breath, keeping your hands there, and just notice what you notice, right? So you can try it again, inhaling deep and exhaling. And then just paying attention for half a second. What do you notice? And there's no right or wrong reason, no wrong or right answer. It's just you notice what you notice. And hopefully what you notice is that, one, that when you breathe this way, you're getting more oxygen in. Some people even say, oh, I feel a little lightheaded. Yeah, because we're not used to getting in so much oxygen. And we have to exhale a little bit longer than you inhale because we have to get rid of that carbon dioxide. Because if you have a carbon dioxide machine at home, you know if you don't let out, if you get a carbon dioxide leak, that's not good for you. Well, it's the same with your body. If we're under stress, we're anxious, we're traumatized, and we're breathing from our chest, we're not getting in enough oxygen for our brain and the rest of our bodies, and we're not letting out enough carbon dioxide. So it has to be inhaling through the nose and exhaling maybe a little longer for the carbon dioxide to leave your body, so that you can get the full benefit of the breath. If you want to turn to the next slide, I think we have another slide. Okay. And so, like I said, in my practice, a lot of what I do is just this, is giving the information, what is trauma, the benefits of breathing, and then I also talk about grounding. And the reason that I talk about grounding is because it's helpful to kind of just be able to center. And at the end of this webinar, before we end, I want to try something with you all about grounding techniques that we can all do together. And I'm hoping that you can continue that when you have your a little bit of a break. So we can get rid of the slide. I think we're done with that. One of the, are there any questions, Francisca? Make sure there are any questions.
So yeah, so we just want to motivate folks. I know that that Lou covered a lot of the physiology of trauma as well, and how it shows up in our body. So we're totally curious if this is resonating with you all, if it sounds like familiar sensations and experiences that you've had in your own body. So we'd love to hear if there are any sort of reflections on that, if you can write them in the chat box. And then also to mark or to add to what Lou was saying, is that trauma is not apolitical, right? Trauma is, it's a tool. It's a tool that the state, that the governments that many of us have been under, and specifically the US government, uses to wield it against us, right? I think more than ever, I've seen so many of our sites of struggle be named as sites of health crisis, of both mental health crisis and of literal physical medical crisis, right? And right now, all of that is heightened. And I think we could say that we're going through this global traumatic moment where there's so much toxic stress, I think, for all humans, but particularly for our people who are on the ground, who've been organizing for a long time, and then for the families and all of our loved ones that might be inside detention. And knowing that trauma isn't a sort of like coincidence, it's not an incidental by default type thing that the state happens to have as an effect. It really is a tool that the state wields against us. And that has been proven to work, right? Has been proven to really break spirits, break bodies. And as you saw in the physiology of our people, right? Of us, of everyone, it has literal physical effects on our body that really lead to our functioning, our everyday ability to breathe, like Lou was marking, our ability to act in healthy ways, and also our narratives, both about ourselves and each other and the world and the possibilities and what we're up against. And so I just kind of wanted to affirm that it's not apolitical, and that the state really uses it in a very intentional way, and that these are the effects, the ones that Lewis is talking about, that it has on us. So curious if this is something you've noticed in your own body. What about what was said is new, different? We do have a question. Is there a grounding technique that you recommend, Lou, in Spanish that feels easy to explain to others?
Yeah, I'll do it at the end, but one of the things that so grounding can be using any of our five senses, right? So touch, visual, audio, taste, and smell. So there's aromatherapy. That's why it works, because it does help kind of deactivate a little bit of that, the amygdala. I do a lot of stones. I touch stones a lot. And so when I work with kids, I have them pick their favorite stone, a little bit smaller than this, so they can carry it in their pockets when they get anxious, and we make up a story. When I work with folks, I have a couple of clients that pray the rosary. And so what we do is I ask them to bring the rosary, and every bead is a breath in and breath out, one full breath. And so when they say the rosario, they're breathing, they say their prayer, they take a breath. And so they're very intentional about it. I'll talk a little bit about other things that I think is helpful. But I will share with you some of a grounding technique that we can do anywhere, really. But I think what I wanted to talk about, Francisca, what she was saying about that, about trauma and about our people, I think we also have to keep in mind historical trauma. I think that it's important to understand that the trauma that this pandemic is new for many people, right? This has never happened worldwide except for the flu of 1917, 1918. However, our people have always gone through trauma since the time of colonization. And so I think it's important that we understand that no, we didn't heal from that trauma. We never had ceremonies to help us heal from the trauma of colonization, of displacement, of genocide, of slavery. No one ever had that opportunity to heal. And so I say about how I practice with my clients, I always talk about the spiritual healing. There was never any ceremonies that I know of that my community ever did to heal when the border crossed down, because we were constantly going back and forth, right? From, Latin America to what's the United States now. I mean, there's still families living on the border. We never got to heal from having many of our traditions taken away from us. When I started thinking about when the pandemic was officially announced and they were talking about the stay-at-home order, what I started thinking about was, I wonder how my ancestors felt when the Europeans came to the Americas and there was these diseases, chickenpox, measles, that were happening, that were killing people. What did they think? They probably thought like we're thinking it's the end of the world, right? And so I think it's important that we understand that we come from people who have gone through trauma multiple generations, right? And have never been able to heal. And so when I talk with my clients, I always tell them, those who are spiritual, do a practice of connecting with your ancestors. Do a practice of asking them for guidance and support, because I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful that we do that, because I think it helps us to connect with our ancestors' pain, but it also helps us not feel like we're alone. Also, I also tell people, connect with the medicines that were given to you a long time ago. Like hierba buena, manzanilla, smudging copal, palo santo. That is all medicine that has been passed down to us. That is medicine to help deal with a very difficult time. this trauma is not the first trauma for the human race. This trauma, we have always had traumas, and we have always had medicines. And so that's one thing that I try to help my clients, those who are open to it, is, you know, if you want to be more spiritual, then find your medicine. Do a ceremony for yourself that feels like it's helping you heal, because we have lost that. It's been taken away from us. We have a little bits and pieces, at least I do. And so I think, you know, trying to reconnect with our traditions and our rituals is helpful as well.
Thank you, Lou.
And I think also, go ahead.
There is one more question. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. There's a couple more questions, so I just wanted to mark that.
Yes, go ahead.
So one more is, I'm just going to read it out loud. Thank you so much for this webinar. I was wondering if you could talk more about how trauma affects the memory, and or how to support migrants as they're forced to recount traumas for the sake of their asylum cases in an attempt to fight against their own deportations.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna read the second one just so it's saying in the queue of your head. There is another one around how to allow oneself to not repress. You know, they've learned about trauma in the past, but they've repressed so much. And so how do we even begin that process so there won't be like this huge flood and takeover, right? Which is the scary part for a lot of us who want to heal, is like, oh, it's going to take over me, it's too much, you know? So those are the two things that came.
Okay, so the memory part. So if you remember, I said, I talked about the prefrontal cortex, and I'm not a brain person, but what I've learned. So if you are like this memory of this webinar, it's not traumatic. So it's going to go, the memory is going to go through the natural process. But when you have a traumatic memory, it goes immediately, bypasses and goes to your amygdala. So it's kicked off by emotions, right? So it can be kicked off by, let's say, there was a traumatic event and there was the scent of roses. You had a bouquet of roses. So you're going to associate that memory with roses. So the next time, maybe if you smell roses, your pot of frijoles, right? You're going to be reminded, those emotions are going to come up for you, and you're going to be triggered, and you're going to perhaps go back to the painful memory. You might not even go through all the actual what actually happened, but it's just your body remembers it. And I think that's important to understand, is that the body has a memory. And if we don't help the body to be able to deal with that memory in a different way, we educate our body, then it's always going to be roses, something horrible, my body tenses up, right? And so there are different ways of dealing with trauma, different techniques, cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma exposure therapy. There's different therapies. But one of the things, I go back to the breathing, is the breathing sends, like I said, sends signals to your brain, the rest of your body. So even if you're smelling the roses, what you're doing by doing the taking deep breaths and doing some grounding is you're telling your body, it's okay, you're safe. The grounding is reminding you you're safe. The breathing exercise is helping your body to deal with the immediate response of wanting to run or fight or freeze, by teaching it that it's okay. So what happens to the brain is that we have, if you remember back in grade school, they were teaching us about neurons and atoms and all that. Well, I should have paid closer attention, because it comes in handy now. What happens is when you form a habit, you have the synapses of the neurons, right? And that creates a habit, right? How you do things. So if you drive to work, you probably take the same route all the time. And sometimes you don't even remember the last 5 minutes of the drive. And that's because the brain is kicking in the neural pathways. That's the neural pathway. It just kicks in. That's where we're going to go. But let's say there's construction on that route and you have to take a different route. You might start off and you're like, oh, shoot, I forgot. I can't go through this route. I have to go through a new route, right? That's what I try to do in therapy. I tell people we're trying to create a new neural pathway of how your body responds when it's talking about a traumatic event, when it's remembering about a traumatic event. We're trying to teach your body, yes, the roses are associated with the event, but the roses are not dangerous. And so we're going to teach your body how to respond differently to something that triggers some emotions. Like I said, there are different techniques, but what I do is I do the breathing, the grounding. I also do body movements. So if someone is, I've had people who have panic attacks because we're talking about something and something comes up. And like we were talking about those memories, sometimes it comes up right there when we're talking. And then, they're telling me my hands are sweaty, my heart is pounding, oh my God, I'm going to faint. Then what I do is I talk them through it, right? Okay, let's breathe. Just pay attention to your breath, or pay attention to my voice, or hold on to the stone. Tell me what you feel. Different ways of bringing that person grounded so that person then is in the present. And then we will start talking about, okay, if the tightness in your chest, can you roll your shoulders back? Can you open it up? Can you, this is what's happening in your pathway, right? So let's try to smell something, right? Again, is to try to help that person from getting too much overwhelmed by their emotions. Now, what happens so that you don't open that can of worms? Everybody works differently. What I tell my clients from the get-go is, I don't need to know details. I don't need to know about your trauma. What I want to do is I want to know how it affects you so you can deal with the effects. In the event that you want to tell me about your trauma, we can talk about it. But it's not going to change the trauma. It happened. But I want to talk about the effects. And I've had clients that have been with me for 2 years. I've never known really a lot of details about their trauma. But once they felt like, okay, I have done, I also encourage people to do acupuncture. There's acupuncture that actually helps for trauma. Once they've done the acupuncture, they come to therapy, they are doing some kind of yoga practice or some kind of meditation, and they feel in a good place, then they will often say, okay, I want to talk about the trauma. And then they have all the tools that they need so that they don't spiral into all of these memories. Not saying that that's guaranteed, but it helps them a little bit more to be able to manage those emotions. So talking about ways of dealing with the trauma, so I have a few suggestions. So we talked about using all 5 senses. We've heard a lot about mindfulness, and mindfulness basically is what I'm telling you right now, which is what we all did right now if you participated with me, which is putting your hand on your chest and one on your stomach. And you were not paying attention to anything else. You were just paying attention to my instructions, right? That's being mindful. That's being only focused on one thing. And it's necessary to do that. And it's necessary, even if you don't feel you have trauma, you're anxious, that's okay. But it's necessary to be mindful and do one thing at a time, because we live in a capitalist society, we have been told that we have to multitask. Well, research is coming out now that the brain should not be multitasking. We should be focusing on one thing only when we're doing something. But because we live in this capitalist society, we are shamed if we cannot do 2 or 3 different things, right, at one time. But mindfulness is totally opposite. It's telling you to do one thing, think about one thing. And it's not about relaxation, it's more about grounding. So if you can, get into mindfulness and just practice what we just did, the hand on the chest, hand on the stomach, 3 breaths, that's fine. That's an interruption to to perhaps your anxiety or the stress. The other thing that that I ask people to try is yoga. So, and if you want to visit my website, I'm hoping to have some taped yoga sessions, and it's just for anxiety, it's for depression, it's for individuals that work with PTSD. And the reason for that I do the yoga, I do therapeutic yoga, and I just focus on a particular issue, right? If you do yoga, I would just recommend that you do it with someone that's trauma informed, because yoga is a very intimate, close practice sometimes with an instructor. So you want to make sure that it's accessible, also that it's accessible to all bodies. And so the yoga that I do with elders, Spanish speakers, I do with people with different sized bodies, because we're not all the same, and our abilities are not all the same. So I try to make it as accessible as possible. The other thing that I do in practice is chanting. Chanting, there has been studies that chanting actually deactivates a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is, if you looked at the brain, it's the amygdala is here and the default is this one here. When the amygdala is stimulated, actually it's backwards, the amygdala is here, the default is here. When the amygdala is stimulated, the default is that part of the brain when you want to sit still and your thoughts are just racing. That's the default network mode. And what they've done with studies is that they've had like Buddhist monks who are chanting. They can actually deactivate that part of the brain. And if you deactivate this part of the brain, it then soothes the amygdala. So chanting can be, sometimes I have my healing bowl and I chant with the clients, and I tell them, just practice. There's a lot of stuff on YouTube on chanting. You know, find something that feels comfortable to you. So chanting is also a good way of kind of just deactivating a little bit that amygdala. And like I said, in my practice, I try just like about everything because everybody is different.
Thank you, Lou. We're actually at time or close to time. We can have probably another 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. I did want to put out a couple more things that came up. There is someone who just spoke about the challenge of being ongoingly exposed, you know, to just the violence and trauma experienced by her detained or their detained clients. And that, you know, the breathing exercise is helpful, but it's just like an ongoing sort of exposure to the violence and the trauma of other folks that they work with.
So the actual worker is exposed to the trauma?
No, I feel like this person might be somebody who has clients who is ongoingly exposed to their own violence and trauma, and how that in itself is really hard for them. And you know, we will have a second webinar on secondary trauma, because that actually is a real thing, that people that are exposed to somebody's violent past or present, or that they can also end up being traumatized themselves in a vicarious way. And so we will have that. And one thing I wanted to mark, I think in the earlier chat, somebody said about working with folks that have to retell their traumatic story is very real. And I do believe that we have a responsibility as organizers, movement builders, attorneys, advocates of any way, folks that work with traumatized people, that yes, we have a political objective that we're trying to meet, and that we're also building their leadership so they can advocate for themselves. But we do have a responsibility as well to center the experiences and the trauma and the violence those people have experienced as well, because we will see the effects on them. I worked with folks who were immigrants who then would be in a press conference, tell their story, and then break out in like sores or hives or get a fever, or just wouldn't show up for a couple weeks because we weren't necessarily tending to the fact that they had to retell a really traumatic story, and we weren't checking in with them about what they needed before that. We weren't checking in with them right after about what they needed after, or what resources or what ways, practices. For me, as I learned being in this movement now for a while, is that we have to build into our organizational culture these kinds of practices, both that Lou was talking about, and just basic, like, how are you doing? Can you tell your story? How do you feel about telling your story? What comes up for you as you're telling your story? And how do we tend to that afterward, right? And it doesn't mean that you, the person that's helping put together the press conference, has to be the person to tend to it if you don't feel skilled enough to do so. It could be that you begin to bring in folks closer and closer, like Lou, or like a traditional healer, or other types of people that can both resource the organization and give practices, or that can help and tend to this person right after the press conference for a good 20-30 minutes, right? So we have to start building in some of this into our own organizations, into our own practice, just like we build into our own practice every day. If you're going into a detention center, or every other day, or every week, what is it that you're coming home to do, and how do you release some of that energy that you're carrying from it, right? So that it doesn't spill on over to everything you do the rest of the day or the rest of the week, or into like your sleep, into your dreams. I mean, she said it, like Lou said it, it's in our nervous systems, right? It's gonna have an effect whether we're cognitively aware of it or not, like our breathing, our posture, our memory, like somebody asked earlier. And the second thing is, how are we also really centering some of this in our own practice with others collectively, right? So how do we encourage some of these practices? How do we go in collectively to do them? And noticing the difference that it's making in our bodies, right? So we don't need to know, I really appreciate you saying that, like, we don't need to know everybody's trauma story. It's good, but trauma doesn't live in the story, trauma lives in the body. And the more that we tend to how trauma is manifesting in our bodies, the better we're going to be, right? So we just got to remember that it doesn't live in the story, it lives in our nervous systems. And the more that we tend to our nervous systems, and all the traditional healing that Lou mentioned, the meditation, the breathing, the focusing on one thing at a time, so we're not split in 10 directions and activating maybe some of these triggers and things, the more that we'll be able to really tackle the residual energy of those traumatic events. And it's the same for the people that we work with, right? It's the same. They don't have to tell us the whole of their story. What we want to do is tend and figure out how to support their own healing and their own nervous systems regulating, right? And so I just wanted to mark that because it's something that came up, and it's a thought that was triggered both on the presentation that you gave, Lou, and then some of the things that people are saying in my own practice with migrant people, and me as an actual organizer for some time. So,
and I think I wanted to add, so I think it's also important to remember that as organizers and activists and advocates, is that we have this culture that you have to work 26 hours, 8 days a week. That's not doable. You can do it, you can probably do it for the first 10 years, but then you're gonna get burned out. And then what happens if you get burned out? Then that means you step back and there's one less person doing the work. And so when I talk with people who are doing the work in communities, with mental health, or just doing hard work, is that especially people of color, we don't know how to practice self-care. No one ever taught us how to do self-care. Not many of us have had the luxury of being able to practice self-care. But what I tell people is we need to practice self-preservation. We need to learn how to preserve ourselves and our energy. And if you come from the Latinx community, there is no individualism. So this is totally not part of our vocabulary. And so many times I ask people, how did people around you take care of themselves? What did they do to take care of themselves? And it's really, really hard. Some will say, oh, and my dad would come and then drink beer and just watch TV. And then, oh, my mom, well, she never took care of herself. Like she was always taking care of everybody. Well, those are the two people that usually are teachers. And if we never learn how to take care of ourselves, then we don't know how to do it. And so if we can do it, if we can think about it more as self-preservation, how can we preserve our energy and our well-being so we can continue to in this movement long term? Because if not, then, you know, that's when you get overworked, you're exhausted, you're stressed, and then that's when the stress of this work is really going to take you down, and it's really going to cause the effects of the trauma, and that's the vicarious trauma. And so we have to really, really be true about practicing self-preservation. So if we could do the grounding technique, I think that would be a good time to do it now.
Go for it.
Okay. So this is something you can do with your with the individuals you work with who are going through trauma, and those of us who work with trauma. Usually I would do this on the floor, and I will put my middle finger and index finger and place it on the side. But because I'm sitting, you can place it on the desk in front of you. And we're going to practice that 3-part breath. And so we're going to sit up straight, shoulders back. And if you want to close your eyes or a soft gaze in front of you. And then we're going to inhale deep through our nose and exhale through our mouth as if we're blowing through a flute. As you're inhaling deep, feel your body rise. As you exhale, feel your body resting just a little bit more. Continue breathing deep through your nose, exhaling through your mouth as if you're blowing through a flute. Feel your lungs filling up, and then feel your lungs emptying out. The next time you exhale, I want you to press a little bit, apply a little bit of pressure on your fingers onto the desk. And when you inhale, release that pressure. Exhale, apply pressure, fingers to the desk. When you inhale, relieve a little bit of that pressure. Continue feeling your body rise when you inhale. Feel your body resting and your fingers pressing against the desk or the floor. And then going back to your natural breath, but continue to press when you exhale, when you are exhaling. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes and then just notice what you notice. Now, this is something that you can do when you're driving. Obviously, don't close your eyes, please. But you can hold on to the steering wheel, and when you exhale, grab tighter on the steering wheel. Inhale, feel your body rise. Exhale, squeeze a little bit of the steering wheel. You can do this on the floor. You can do it on the desk. You can do your hands onto your lap. And so it's just a very easy, accessible way of just grounding. Like I said, I will be posting some exercises in English and Spanish, yoga, grounding exercises on my website. Give me a week. The community has been reaching out, asking for more resources. So I'm gonna place those resources there, and also for kids, because I think we also need to think about the kids that are going through this traumatic event. And so we're gonna be doing some storytelling for kids in English and Spanish on how to name their emotions so parents can help them cope with this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Lou, for all your generosity and your wisdom. Really appreciate you. And we really appreciate everybody who joined today. And we will be sending out the recording to all those who registered. There were a little over 100 people that registered. There were 45 or something that joined. And then I've shared in the chat Lou's information. There will be a lot of free resources that I'm super excited to check out that she will be offering. And lastly, we will be sending out some resources. Somebody requested on the chat that we send out just like some basic resources on like a basic handout. And so I feel like we have some of those. And again, thank you so much for joining. And if there's anything that comes up or questions, do check out LatinxTherapistActionNetwork.org. We're trying to also build an online platform where people can get resources as well to be able to do everything that we were just putting out. Thank you again, and thanks to Detention Watch Network.
Thank you all.
Have a good rest of your day, everybody.